Hi, welcome to A Foreigner in the Philippines. Every time that Talik and I used to arrive at this spot on the motorcycle when we were driving from Taliban, she would come with me and we'd ride and we'd come to this spot, and she was only maybe 6 or 7, and I would try to tell her that this would probably be the most beautiful place that she had ever seen. And it reminded me of a book by John Steinbeck, which I'm actually reading again now because a friend managed to find a copy, and it was called The Pastures of Heaven. And this was what I imagined. A battle-weary soldier poised on the hill on his horse, and he looked out over this valley which he called the pastures of heaven. And John Steinbeck wrote about the pastures of heaven. It was in a place, not sure whether it was real. It was real to me after his stories, but he told poignant short stories that were centered in this valley called the pastures of heaven. And I always used to stop here on the bike, and no matter what time of the day it would always be different, and it would always be beautiful. Look at that down there. Now the sun is setting now, so the shadows are long. Look at that little valley there. There'll be a creek down there, that's why it's so abundant and green. And the stories from the pastures of heaven are, gosh, it's an overworked, when you read his books, it's an overworked word to say poignant, because they are sad, and yet they are somehow, he's learned to break your heart in an acceptable way. Just like here now, looking at this lady with her carabao, a most prized possession, and she does this road every day with this carabao. Hello ma'am, how are you? And that young man, he's helping his mom. And our dog, Poggy, is spending time with their dog. Well, in the pastures of heaven there are all kinds of interesting people, and the one that touched me just recently I read was that the story starts in just on the outskirts of the pastures of heaven, and Molly Morgan is there to apply for the job as school teacher, and it's a one-room school. All the kids are all in there together, every age, every grade, and she is applying for the post, and it's her first job. She's never had a job as a school teacher, so she's very nervous. And the bus driver puts her out on the road and points to the pastures, is there, and she says, will somebody come and pick me up? And he says, not unless you have arranged it. Well, how will I get there? Well, I guess you'll walk, miss. Well, no sooner has she picked up her bag to walk then a pickup truck stops, and a man leans out and says, are you going to the pastures of heaven, miss? And he said, it's okay, you're safe, I'm Bert Monroe, I live in the pastures of heaven. And she said, well, she was still uncertain, of course, but she said, well, yes I am. Here's the returning Poggy. Come on, Poggy. So she says, well, I'm the new school teacher. Well, I think I'm the new school teacher. So Bert Monroe says, well, come in and I'll take you, she said. She tells him that she has an appointment with John Whiteside at the big White House. And Bert says, I'm going right past there. My farm is right next to John Whiteside. So in she climbs, and she's put off at the gate to a winding path that leads to the house of John Whiteside. And John Whiteside is a very kind man who loves the pastures of heaven and occupies a very special place there. He's on the school board, and he is one of those people that other people congregate around, and they seek his advice and they have talks, and he's an interesting, kindly man. And Molly, her name is Mary Morgan, and she is Molly. So Molly stands at the door and rings a bell, and Willa is the wife of John Whiteside, and she says, yes, dear. And she said, I'm here to interview for the job of school teacher. And so she goes in and she talks to John Whiteside, and she's very nervous. And when he asks her questions about her life, can I get to know you? At this point in the interview, I usually ask for a little background on whoever is applying for the job, so that I know a little bit about them. Molly's eyes cloud over, and she goes back into her childhood. And she remembers her mother, and her mother was, in the story, a pitiful lady who loved her husband and was almost a shadow of herself when her husband was not there. And she whined and complained and begged for the love of her children. And the children were embarrassed by the fact that she was begging for their love. She would ask them, can you come and sit with me? And they would run away and hide. And Molly felt bad that that's the way that she felt too. But her father was this magical figure in her life. Her father was a traveling salesman, and he would go away for extended periods of time. But when he came home, it was like a magical holiday. Because when he came home, all of the kids in the neighborhood would gather. It was as if they were all his children. And he would have a gift for everyone. And he would bring back magical gifts, little tractors that would work in the sand, and mechanical toys, and little toys that made sounds that were musical. And he would tell about the places that he had been to India, and he had been to magical places and seen all of these things which they felt that they would never be able to see. But not just that he had a way of telling it that made you feel as if you were there. And everybody adored him. And Molly adored him, especially. And one particular day that he came back, he brought a puppy, and it was for Molly. And he gave it to Molly. And one of their brothers said, "Pa, what kind of dog is that?" And her father said, "It's $1.50 dog, that's what it is." "What's $1.50 dog, Dad?" I said, "Well, when you go in and you ask for $1.50 dog, it's a little bit like going in and asking for $1.50 of candy. You get this kind of candy, and a boiled candy, and a soft center, and a chocolate. You don't just get one, you get a whole ton of them." And that's the same with the dog, and this is $1.50 dog. Well, Molly took the dog out and she showed it around the yard, and she held it up. And she held it up at the fence so that it could see over and see even more. And the puppy somehow fell, and it was laying there with its leg twisted in a strange shape. And it was crying a terrible, terrible, agonized cry. And Molly stood there and she didn't know what to do. But our brother came down and he looked at the dog. He said, we can't allow it. We can't let it be in pain. And he rushed over to the woodpile and he brought back an axe, and he swung the axe once. And then he ran away. And Molly stared down at what was left. And then her father came out. And his face was grey with sadness. And he looked at the little dog and he covered it with a gunny sack. And he took it away. And they had a funeral, and the father made them listen to another story. And as they listened to their story, another magical story of a place that he had been and the things he'd seen, then gradually the pain of the little dog was left behind. And the father said to Molly, you must never mention this to your brother again. That he did what he did. He is hurting already too much. Well, when his visits were over and the magic had gone, the children would go to bed knowing what would happen. This was after about 2 weeks. And after 2 weeks, the father would go out and he would go into town, and when he came home, he would be drunk. And he would stumble coming into the house, and they would know what was going to happen. And then they'd hear the mother crying and begging him. And the next morning, he was gone, taking all their hearts with him. And she came back, and there's John outside, and she said, well, I guess you could say that I didn't have a father in my childhood. My mother was alone. And she went back again, and she, into her memories, because one day the father left and he never returned. And the mother said after several years that he must be dead, otherwise he would have come back. And she worked as best she could to support the family, and the boys began to work as soon as they were able, and the family survived. But Molly knew that he would come back someday and find her, and she held that hope in her heart very much. So obviously she gets the job as school teacher, and John Whiteside says to her, well, where will you live? You'll need to find a room. And without thinking, Molly says, I want to live here. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't know what I was saying. It's just that I really like this place. Well, John calls his wife in and says, Willa, we have this young lady wants to room and board with us. And Willa looks at her and says, absolutely not. much too pretty, that son of ours will be just an idiot. You can have that room at the top, we don't use it much. And so she goes to live at the house of John Whiteside, and she becomes a teacher, and she is a storyteller, and very, very quickly the whole town embraces her and takes her into their hearts. And she knows all of the children, of course, and she knows all of the families, and they would never think of having a party without having Molly organise it. And she settles into a life in the pastures of heaven. And very quickly she is invited in and becomes a very important part of the school board meetings when they preside over things that are going to happen in the school and how it should go and so on, and she becomes a vital part of that. Well, one day Bert Monroe is late, which is very unusual for him, and he comes in halfway through the board meeting and he apologises, and he said, I've just come in from town. I had to go and pick up my farmhand. I'm calling him a farmhand, but actually he is completely useless. I don't get a lick of work out of him, but it's more than I dare do to fire him, because the children love him. He's been everywhere, he's done everything. He can tell a story that will weave a spell around you, and you will not be able to stop listening. And every time, once a week or once a fortnight, he goes on a bender and he goes into town, into Salinas, and he gets drunk and he falls in the street, and the police call me, and I have to drive down there in the pickup and pick him up. And I just got back from Salinas now, and he's in the truck and he's drunk, but I can't get rid of him. What am I going to do? And Molly listens to this and her heart goes cold, and she keeps telling herself it can't be, it just can't be. And she makes her excuses and she says, do you mind if I don't stay? I'm not feeling so well and I'd like to go. And of course all the men say, of course, Miss Morgan, you go up and rest. And she goes out and she goes into the cold night air, and a few yards away she sees Bert Monroe's pickup truck. And she walks slowly towards it. She says, I'm crazy, I'm destroying everything that I have. I know that my father will come and get me. And she went through the little dream that she had of her father. She would open the door one day and there he would be. And he would be in a fine dress coat and he would be wearing a top hat. And he would say, come, Molly, I've come for you, let's go. We've got so many places to see. Get dressed, get ready, and I'll take you now. She never went further than that because she knew it was crazy. But it was something that she held in her heart just to hold it together and keep the memory of her father. Well, her steps have taken her almost to where the truck is, and inside the open bed truck she could hear the sounds of someone that you can tell is drunk and just snoring and making those kinds of sounds. And she stops herself and says, I can't, no, it's not him. And she goes back in and she goes to her room and she's terrified. And when the board meeting is over, she goes down and she speaks to John. I said, I must talk to you. And she said, I have to go. Can you take me into Salinas? And he says, well, of course I can, you know. We'll go first thing in the morning. No, I have to go now. I have to leave. I have to leave the pastures of heaven. And he says, well, is there something I can do? And she said, no. It's just something I have to do. And I have to leave. He said, well, we'll organise, give us time to find a substitute. And then, no, she said, no. I must go now. Please. Just take me. And John Whiteside understands that something has happened that he doesn't understand. And he says, well, I don't know why, but it would almost be discourteous of me to understand why. So, if you're ready, I'll take you to Salinas now. And Molly and he drive to Salinas. Of course, there's much more to the story than that, but it's one of those stories which so many in the pastures of heaven are, where they make you feel, he makes you feel that you're the person in the story, that there's something there which somehow he already knew about you. So I'm almost home. I don't know what the camera's been doing because I've just been walking along trying to keep upright, and the sun is almost down. There it is. It's a different view from here. So I'll say goodbye. Thanks for being with me and for listening. And don't forget, there's a wonderful book there with wonderful stories. And it's by John Steinbeck and it's called The Pastures of Heaven. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe. And I hope my angles on the camera have not been too crazy. Bye for now.